Hello, everyone, and welcome to PNP Live. Thank you so much for joining us in this new format where we can continue to bring authors and their new books to the politics and prose community. As this is a new venture, please bear with us as we work out all of the kinks and get more comfortable with this new platform. A few things before we begin. At any time during this event, you can click on the green button below to purchase tonight's book on Politics and Prose website. We're currently offering free media mail shipping on all domestic orders, and your online purchase goes to support our small business at a time when we truly need it the most. Just like at all of our in-person events, you're still able to ask a question to the author, and you can do that in the button below. You can click ask a question, and you can submit your question as well as read other questions and then vote up or down with the arrows there, depending on the questions you like the most. And unlike in our in-person events, the author, host, and audience members cannot see you through the screen. So feel empowered to stay in your pajamas without judgment. Finally, we want to thank you all so much for being here with us tonight. As you know, small businesses and especially bookstores are getting hit especially hard in these uncertain times. But we're dedicated to still bring you the first-class content that we are known for. So we're thankful to our loyal customers like all of you who are keeping both our business and our spirits afloat. And so without further ado, we are very pleased to welcome Alex Halberstadt to PNP Live. Alex is the author of the award-winning Lonely Avenue. His writing has appeared in The New Yorker, The New York Times Magazine, Travel and Leisure, GQ, Saveur, Paris Review, among others, and he is a two-time James Beard Award nominee. He will be joined in conversation with Ivan Siegel, a photographer, artist, writer, and leader in the development of alternative media organizations and author of White Road. And so now please join me in welcoming to PNP Live, Alex Halberstadt and Ivan Siegel.
Alex?
Thank you, Alan.
I think this is you.
Thanks, Ivan. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you to PNP for Politics and Prose for making something really great out of a really difficult moment. Thank you to Ivan for joining me in this conversation. And thank you to all of you for tuning in. I want to talk tonight and read a little bit at the top from a new book called Young Heroes of the Soviet Union, a family memoir about 3 generations of my family in Russia and the former Soviet Union and other places. I'm going to read for a few minutes, and then Ivan and I will have a conversation, and then we'll take questions from you. So this very brief reading comes from a scene that takes place in 1979 in Moscow, then in the Soviet Union, and it happens on the day that my mother and her family and I leave the Soviet Union for good, and my father and his family remain. On the day my mother and I arrived at Sheremetyevo Airport with our suitcases, we had 24 hours left to leave the country. Our plane tickets to Vienna had cost 2,000 rubles, roughly 15 times my mother's monthly salary. My father had given her most of the money in exchange for her share of our apartment. She paid another smaller sum to renounce our Soviet citizenship and internal passports. After selling nearly everything, all she had left were 2 sweaters, several blouses and skirts, several pairs of underwear, a winter coat, 2 pairs of shoes, a portable camera, 3 jars of etc. caviar that someone said she could sell abroad, and a hardbound book of poems by Anna Akhmatova. The memory of that last morning in Moscow has the sickening vividness of moments after one is struck by a car. My grandmother's husband, Mikhail Mikhailovich, drove in near silence. There are times when I believe I could retrace that drive to the airport, turn by turn, even today. My father sat stiffly in the passenger seat. I sat in the back, sandwiched between my mother and Tamara, who didn't let go of my hand until the air traffic control towers came into view. That morning, my great-grandmother refused to say goodbye to us and shut herself in her room. At the airport, a uniformed woman led my mother and then me into separate cubicles for a final customs inspection. I dropped some coins into a tray. My mother recalled that we were allowed to take with us one photo album, no art or antiques, no more than 5 grams of gold, and exactly 137 United States dollars. Before they said goodbye and embraced, my mother handed my grandmother Tamara the gold watch that Tamara had given her as a wedding gift. Another customs officer, a man, ordered my mother to strip, while yet another tapped the heels of her boots to check for precious stones. She was trembling because she'd heard that some women were subjected to gynecological exams at the airport. A week later, my mother's parents, Simeon and Raisa, would stand in a similar room at another airport, while a customs agent slid open the soles of their shoes with a razor and then unceremoniously threw the contents of their suitcases onto the floor. Tell the Jewish professor to remain calm, the agent barked at the soldier at the door. For a few minutes after our luggage was returned to us, my mother and I stood in the featureless hallway outside the customs area and stared through plate glass at the jet that would take us to Vienna. The fuselage was marked with aeroflots, winged hammer and sickle. The morning was bright and cloudless, and my mother and I lingered by a window at Sheremetyevo Airport in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, though we no longer counted among its citizens or those of any other country. On the way to our gate, we took a wrong turn into a diplomatic lounge furnished with Scandinavian leather and chrome furniture. The moment had a dreamlike quality. No one spoke to us or asked to see our documents. We wandered out onto a glass balcony overlooking the waiting area. My father and Tamara stood below us. They looked up and spotted us, and they waved. My father was crying. They'd been there for more than 2 hours, unable to make up their minds to go home. I waved back for what seemed like a long time, standing there in my puffy nylon jacket and wool hat. My mother held my hand. Take a good look at your father, she told me, because you will never see him again. Hey, Ivan.
Hey, Alex.
You still with us?
I'm still here. I still am. It's an amazing passage.
Thank you.
Some of those images that you draw with writing have the sharpness, the vividness of a still photograph. I'm kind of astounded by the sharpness of your memory, based in this idea of a trauma in which you're struck, and then you're able to hold all of those memories throughout the next 20 years, the next 25 years, or longer. And I noticed that there are other passages in the book that are like that as well. There are places where you have just incredible recall for the events. And I'm curious about 2 things. One, which is about the relationship between memory and trauma. And the other is about the way you're able to kind of draw or coalesce those images almost in a formal way into a picture.
Right.
Yeah.
That's a really interesting question. I guess to address the first part of it, I think, when writing this book, this book took me an extraordinarily long amount of time to write, over 10 years. And one of the things that I discovered, I think to my dismay, is that memories are not facts. By which I mean not only that we don't remember things as they happen, but we actually, our memories change over time, and they are hugely undependable. I recently read that from a neuroscience perspective, memories degrade every time that we access them. The more times we actually bring up a memory, the less vivid and the less accurate it becomes. And I think in the process of writing this book, I realized that what I was writing about weren't facts exactly. I mean, I tried to be as factual as I could, but for the more personal moments, I realized that what was happening is I was writing about my own memories, meaning my own distorted, subjective versions of my life. And of course, those versions had come to mean different things to me than they would have meant 20 years earlier. And I realized that it was that very subjectivity, it was that very kind of wiliness of memory and the way that it kind of betrays us, that I found ultimately really interesting. Often I would go to my mother and say, remember this thing that happened to me when I was a child. And I remembered it visually, not just as a fact, but I could actually see it. It was almost like a small film reel in my mind, and my mother would look at me and say, that never happened. And I knew that she was right. So yeah, I mean, this what I found really interesting is the way that we create memories almost out of our desires, out of our sort of need for things to be a certain way. And ultimately they become kind of their own entities. They become detached from the events that actually gave rise to them.
I think I realized that at some point in the text, I was kind of mulling over this question of how you were able to draw such a kind of a fine-grained image of the past, and thinking, well, either you have a photographic memory, or because I could never do that. And then I thought, wait a second, no, this is a book of memory. This is a subjectivity, and that's also really interesting from a perspective of memoir, because before I picked this book up, I really thought this book was about your uncle. I mean, your grandfather. I thought this book was about Vasily, who I'm sure you're going to talk about in a little while. Sure. Who was this is not a spoiler, folks, who was one of Stalin's bodyguards. And I really expected it to be more like a social history. Right. And then it went off in a very personal direction, and I went with it, and the further it went in that direction, the more I realized that there was this kind of fascinating tension between a book being a book of history and a memoir and a book of memory, and how you kind of balance those two things off, and occasionally even kind of like broke the narrative and actually addressed the reader directly in some ways and said, and now this is what's going to happen, or now here I am and here's how I got here, like GQ paid for this trip and now I'm here. And so I'm curious, how you manage those kinds of tensions, because I'm sure that occurred to you as you're in your writing process. Yeah,
I mean, I wanted the book to be a little uncomfortable, because I wanted it to be sort of, I suppose it's interesting in a certain way to have a grandfather who was a major in the KGB and a bodyguard of Stalin, but I never thought that the book should be about my family or me. I always thought, well, what always interested me was braiding together those two kind of modes to tell a really, to tell a history of the Soviet Union, of Russia, that covers 75 years, which is the span of the book, and also to tell it in a personal way, because I always think that the most interesting way to write about history is to personalize it, to make it understandable as, the events of a person living in that time, not just these kind of large political and historical events of history books. And I think here, in this particular narrative, what happened is in 2004, I went to find my grandfather, because I learned that he was alive. I'd never met him. I'd met him when I was 3 months old, so I had no memory of him. And I called my father in Moscow, and he said, yeah, a cousin called and said that my father's still alive. I was astounded. He was 93, and I had assumed that he had been dead for decades. So I got on a plane and went to a town called Vinnytsia in Ukraine, and I found him. And, initially I thought that what I was doing was writing about my grandfather's life, which is how this project started off. And eventually when I met him, I realized something that became kind of the cornerstone of this book, which is that the things I understood about my family, the way that I explained my family to myself was actually wrong. That in fact, the relationships in my family, the people in my family, my father, my grandparents, my mother, even me, were in fact, these weren't people who were shaped by interpersonal dynamics or by, kind of sort of the vagaries of personality, but we were actually shaped to an extent I never suspected by history and politics and the way that they kind of collided with the lives of the members of my family.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because it's not a standard. At the same time, this book is not a standard history. I mean, a standard history is focused on great men, unfortunately far too often great men, and not great people. But
Exactly.
either the dominant modes of historical narrative are social forces or great personalities, and whether or not you choose one version of understanding the determinism of our history or the other, that really is the mode. And so much of the story that you're telling is spent in the margins. It's you're somewhere far down in the south on the Volga River in a swamp, or you're in Vinica, which is a small town in rural, in provincial Ukraine, or you're growing up at the far southeast corner of Moscow in a Brezhnev era building where there's no stores and no paved roads, or you're wandering around the fringes of Vilnius where the roads peter out into the woods.
Right.
And your story is that way too. Just the topography of your story kind of matches in interesting parallels the historical narrative that's told with an accretion of evidence, and an accretion of experience, and yet you're still telling a history, and that's a really difficult. It's a really difficult thing to pull off. I'm really impressive.
Thank you. Yeah, I when you realize that the history of this country, of this kind of unbelievable experiment that was the Soviet Union, that history has been written many times by eminent historians, and certainly that wasn't going to be my task. But I think what I could tell was the story of the complexity of that country and the way that it was experienced by people who were, Russian, Jewish, Ukrainian, Lithuanian, who actually lived through it. I know, for example, one thing that happens often with people of a certain generation who lived through the 20th century in the Soviet Union is you meet them and you learn almost inevitably that they did something extraordinary. I mean, you, Ivan, have is it a grand uncle who was Stalin's ambassador to France? Mm-hmm. And I don't mean to say that things like that are common, but you often meet people who had witnessed incredible things. And by incredible, usually not wonderful, usually difficult and wretched and devastating things. But I think there's a line in my book where I say that, what I realized about my family is that they lived in a place where the buffer between history and biography had become almost imperceptible. And I think that's true. When I understood my father's life entirely differently after I learned that his grandfather had for 13 years been a member of the KGB, and the organization had different names when he joined it in 1932, and had taken a hand in, had a hand in not just in surveillance and being a bodyguard, but also in torture and murder, in genocide. And when you realize, when I started to think what it must be like to grow up in the sort of near, around people who had actually been through these things, who had done these things, you realize that the force of those experiences, the force of those traumas really warps, everyone around you, not just you, and changes your worldview. And in a way, having come to the United States as a 9-year-old, I felt in some ways that I was protected from that, living in, peacetime United States. And yet the more research I did, the more I realized that wasn't true at all. And there are parts in the book where I write about, kind of my own responses that had been a mystery to me: anxiety, nightmares, various symptoms of what is now probably called PTSD, that suddenly began to make sense when I sort of widened the lens.
Or maybe it's partially true, because there are other things that are happening in your text that keep taking us back to the present too.
Right.
I mean, I was thinking about a certain moment, a certain passage, which takes place, I think, in Vilnius, in which you're talking about this gate in which people, when the Jews went past the gate, they had to take off their yarmulkes, and if they didn't, the Christians would beat them. And it has this kind of medieval quality of this event that's occurring. And then all of a sudden you walk past it and there's this motorcycle gang from Poland dressed in Harley Davidson jackets who are prostrating themselves before this saint, this holy,
it's an icon of a Madonna.
And so there's this kind of incredible, there's this historic moment, and then there's this incredibly prosaic contemporary thing that happens right next to it, which helps to frame it, and also as a reader brings me into it. So it's not just a device. It's also a tension within you as the narrator between. I mean, that's how I interpret it anyway. And there's all sorts of moments like that in which you're both the 9-year-old boy who's been taken to safety, I assume as your mother intended in some ways. I think you say that, and you're also at the same time, experiencing the echoes of the trauma that your family had experienced, and how and that tension is actually something that is an engine in the narrative too.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I started to feel after a while was that, the past, if you spend enough time, kind of going after history, you realize that after a while, that you're not really sure how time works anymore, in the sense that I was always feeling in writing this book, and also in visiting some of these places, that I sort of was existing in several time periods at once. The past almost didn't seem like the past when you're sitting with your grandfather and he's talking about the Holocaust, or he's talking about World War II, or he's talking about participating in the murders of ordinary Russians, which he did. You begin to feel that the past sometimes feels more real than the present. That it actually seems to exert a greater pull. And I think that was one of the strange things. The book keeps telescoping between the past and the present to try to tell the stories and also comment on them in a way.
Right.
And I think that's something I very much wanted to do, because I think that's one of the really fun things about writing nonfiction.
Yeah, quite literally in its structure, right? You're ping-ponging back and forth between different times.
Exactly.
In ways that kind of stretch and elongate and then compress the narrative. It's really forceful as well. Yeah.
Thank you. It's a kind of inexhaustible task. History is endless in a way, but I think the idea of trying to tell a comprehensive story of what happened is impossible. I mean, somebody like Anne Applebaum, who wrote the definitive book on the Gulag, does a wonderful job of it in 1,200 pages or whatever it is. But
I fell asleep trying to read that book several times.
I mean, it's
no offense to Anne.
Yeah, it's a wonderful book, but it's
heavy.
It's heavy, and it's weighty, and it's sort of there's years of research and scholarship. It's incredibly impressive, but at the same time, it was never the kind of thing that I felt that I should do or could do or wanted to do. And I think telling a story, finding one through line through that history, not trying to, encompass all of it or try to present a bunch of facts, but trying to find, a group of people who walk you through that history always seemed to me to be a really worthwhile way to talk about these larger events.
So there's an expression from your father that occurs early in the book that then comes back a couple of times about how he said to you at some point that trying to sort through the past is like digging through the ashes of a cigarette butt or something, words to that effect.
Yeah.
And I'm curious about something that happens with the narrative, which is that as you leave your grandfather behind, and as that story kind of recedes, and you move more fully into kind of unpacking the stories of everybody else in your family and those around them, and then the social history that's next to them, that story kind of sits there like an anchor. And you don't you return to it in ways that are unexpected, but it kind of slides away from the central narrative, and in ways that are and I'm still kind of struggling with how this how that sits with the way you're telling the story, and also this kind of idea about whether it is possible to not sift through the past, or to re-examine it from your father's perspective versus what you're doing, which is rather exhaustively sifting through the past.
Right.
And how you feel about that now, having finished the book, and now that it's actually, a volume that you can hold and stick on the shelf and never to open again if you ever want to get to that point. But you know what I mean? Like now that you've gone through that process. Yeah.
Are you asking whether I think it was worth it?
Not whether it was worth it, but how you feel about it now. Like, finishing a book is a major life event. It's like, especially something like this, which is,
I mean, it's. I really hate the idea that art is supposed to be kind of therapeutic, or it's supposed to help us, close our own psychological loopholes and meet our needs. But of course it does. And I think for me, the subtitle of the book is A Memoir and a Reckoning. And the reckoning was part of it for me. One of the reasons I wanted to write this book is because, my father still lives in Russia. He lives in Moscow. I live in New York. My grandparents are dead. And part of it was trying to, it's a very small family. I don't have any kids, so it's likely that the family won't continue. And I think part of writing this book was trying to kind of come to terms with what it has meant to, live through these things. What does it mean to actually witness all this history, to exist in it? And, and of course, part of it was trying to also explain, what it meant to have had these really difficult relationships, and to understand them not just in the way that fathers understand sons and vice versa, or, we understand our immediate family members, but to understand them in this larger historical, broader sense, to sort of, to try to find some meaning in them that wasn't simply, personal. And I think, just to finish with your question, I also, part of it was also trying to make sense of Russia itself. What does it mean to come from this really difficult, in some ways very traumatized place? And I think in the epilogue of the book, one of the things I really try to do is to talk about, if individuals in this country went through this trauma, and I think one of the models of understanding trauma that I talk about in the book is also the epigenetic model, which is fairly recent. The idea that we are not, that the past doesn't just come to us as stories from our parents and grandparents or from books, but it's actually the trauma experience during those events is something we're born with, and that our genes essentially carry markers containing some of those historical traumas. And the question that I was really interested in, that I ask, and I think it's still a question that will be answered, we still don't know very much about this model and how it works, is also what happens to an entire society of people who carry these markers. What does that do to an entire country? And of course now, with Russia meddling in our elections, which is something that I think we understand that it's happening as Americans. I'm not sure that we understand why it's happening. So I think one of the things I wanted to grapple with is, how does this history explain Russian society and the way that, and the particular sort of peculiarities, I don't want to say pathologies because that's kind of mean, but the peculiarities of Russian society and Russian politics that I think Westerners often really struggle with and struggle to understand, because it is often really inexplicable. But yeah. Shall we?
Yeah, let's
take some questions.
Let's have some questions.
Awesome.
So, those of you who are so kind to join us virtually, we're really sorry that we can't see you in person. However, we do have this wonderful Ask a Question feature, and when you ask them, I will see it, and so will Alex, and then I will read the question out loud so we can have it for the recording as well. And Alex will take a stab at it. So, folks, let's give this a try. Please, please ask us a question, and we'll go from there.
So I guess folks are typing their questions rather than asking them, since we
exactly. They are typing. They are in theoretically typing them.
Theoretically.
Here we go. We have one.
Excellent.
So the question is, how do you reconcile the country you're looking back on and the country today? And how do you reconcile yourself to nostalgia in light of the state of things now? That's a great question.
That's a really great question.
The nostalgia question is fabulous. So yeah,
the nostalgia question is really good. Let's see. Wow.
Want me to read that again?
Yeah, could you?
How do you reconcile the country you're looking back on and the country today? And how do you reconcile yourself to nostalgia in the light of the state of things now?
That's a really, that gets right at the heart of it. Part of the book, part of the way the book works is there's a simultaneous memoir part of the book where I narrate kind of, my childhood, my parents' childhood, my grandparents' lives, narrate the past while simultaneously visiting those places and narrating from the relative present. So there's always a kind of cross-cutting between what was and what is, which I think was very important to me. Speaking specifically about Russia, I don't know if you'll agree with me, Ivan, but in a way, when, having spent 10 years reading about Russian history and talking to people about it, the thing that emerges is actually the country that was is in some ways very different than the country that is today. But in other ways, Russia seems to have an extremely monolithic history, in the sense that, and there's a scene in the book where I speak to a night watchman at a fishing base, and we're standing in the place where the Mongols had their the Golden Horde, the Mongolian army that devastated Russia and ruled it for 250 years. And he says, well, look around us, what's really changed, and we're standing in a village with a dirt road with some wooden houses. And his point was that, people lived in bondage as slaves under the Mongol rule, and then they, lived as serfs under the Tsars, and then they lived on collective farms, essentially, where they couldn't travel and couldn't, didn't have internal passports. It's a very bleak characterization of Russia, but even if you go there now, it is still a country, you can travel, you can, there's the internet, for, though the freedom of being online in Russia is getting curtailed very aggressively now. And a lot of public, people in Russia don't have Wi-Fi at home, so they go to internet cafes. And as of, I think, 2 years ago, the government mandated way to log on to the computer and an internet cafe is to use your passport number. So essentially, the government can keep track of where you've been online and where you're going, which is really terrible. And so in a way, I think the Soviet Union of my childhood and Russia today are in some ways very different, but in other ways, it's very hard for me not to see the similarities. It's an autocratic nation again, full of talented, brilliant people who often, have to put up with almost unbelievable hardship and, deficits, and get through it through, I think a superior sense of Black humor. But so there's been a lot of reconciling. Nostalgia is a really difficult thing, if you mean wishing to return, then I don't have very much nostalgia. I grew up in the United States. I'm queer. I think the prospect of living in Russia right now seems terribly unwelcome. But at the same time, of course, I have tremendous nostalgia for the trappings of my own childhood. And I don't think this is the time to get into sort of academic thoughts about what nostalgia is and how it works. But I think, as with everybody who's come from a tough place, it's it exists kind of it's eternal, and yet at the same time really problematic. And I get mad at myself for the nostalgia sometimes, and sometimes I embrace it. Sorry, that's not a very satisfying answer.
No. I mean, it's obviously nostalgia is not just this monolithic thing. I mean, you have there's this sometimes the vividness of the passages that you're writing about, they don't express explicitly a state of longing, but there's an underlying current of that you feel because the language is so rich. It's like there's something that's driving you to write that language, which which is obviously a very complicated force, and I don't really care we could name it lots of things, but we don't need to do that.
I don't think there's a person on earth who can really claim to experience no nostalgia. I don't think that's possible, no matter how angry we are towards our past, or our parents or the place we came from.
So there's a lot of good questions here. I'm gonna pick them not necessarily in the order they came, but in the order that makes sense for this conversation.
Sure.
So this is a question about the point of order, which is, how old were you when you saw your father again?
When I saw my father again, I was 18 years old, and it had just become possible to travel. The Soviet Union had fallen. I was 19. It was 1989, and I traveled in one of the first months when it was possible to make that trip, because until the Soviet Union had fallen, we were, visiting him was impossible. So when my mother says that to me at the end of that scene, it was literally true. I was never going to see him again. He couldn't leave. I couldn't come back. But as soon as the Soviet Union fell, people, of course, rushed back to see their families, and I did as well.
And so this follow-on question, which is directly related to that, was what it was like to return to Russia for the first time. So I assume that means from probably that was your trip. And how long were you there, and how did that feel?
Wow. I was there, I think, for about 2 weeks, because going for a shorter amount of time doesn't make a lot of sense, given how far away the place is. I think it was fascinating. I was incredibly happy to be back. Of course, I was going with clear eyes, but imagine returning to a place that you never thought you'd see again, and suddenly, who knew in 1970 that the Soviet Union, which had existed for 50 years, would collapse in another 18? It was. I'm sorry. Yeah. Is that right? I'm sorry. 1980, 1979 when we were leaving. Mm-hmm. Right. So yeah, I mean, forgive me, that it would last another 8-9 years, which is what happened. I thought it would last another 70 years. So it was a very joyous experience. It was weird. It was, some parts of it were a little scary, but I was so thrilled to be back, because of course, as a kid, I was 19. I was a sophomore in college, and of course, I had fantasized about these places from my childhood, and thinking that I would never see them again, and suddenly I could. So I think that it was relief and joy and real curiosity, because it was the first time I could really compare my memories with what was really there.
Mm-hmm. So we have a couple of different. There's a bunch of different good questions here now. So forgive me if I'm not answering again in order. And the question is related to this in some ways, and it's about how you feel about the USSR explicitly. Like it's complicated, your sense of Russian American identity, I guess the question is, and whether you feel patriotic about any country, quote, patriotic, as far as the question comes.
I mean, the USSR was an idea more than a country. I mean, and eventually it fell apart, but but it was the country that I grew up in. That country was not Russia. I mean, when I was a kid, we learned that all ethnicities were equal, that religion was, the opium of the people, and that, everyone who lived in this great empire was equal. Of course, my mother was Jewish, so I very quickly was disabused of that idea, because Jews were definitely not equal. They were actually quite unequal. And, but, it was this great utopian idea about, a gigantic, the largest country in the world in terms of, area, that existed across 11 time zones. Again, we come back to the question of nostalgia. I don't think anyone, Well, that's not true. Millions of people miss the Soviet Union because there were a lot.
Putin misses it.
Yeah, Putin misses it. Part of it is nostalgia for empire, which I think is very important to him. But I think a lot of older Russians miss it, and a lot of because it was a time of, relative. After the war, certainly, it was a time of, comparative abundance compared to what came before, and for a while came after. The 90s were a very rough time in Russia. But it was also, a time when, people believed that they were living to realize this huge historical experiment, which is, the state of where everyone was equal. Of course, they weren't, but the belief, it was exciting to live in a place where you were supposed to believe in something that was bigger than yourself. That wasn't God, but that was a social experiment.
America has that feeling too, right? America has also an idea.
America is also an idea.
So,
right?
And you've come to a country that has you came to a country that is another idea, an idea nation.
Right. And it's true. And I think there are great parallels. They were both young countries and huge countries. But also, I think the Soviet Union was a more interesting country than Russia is, because the ideas of the Soviet Union were utopian ideas. I mean, they didn't work out. I mean, the Soviet Union had a shot. They had 70 years to make those ideas work, and it didn't really work. But the Russian ideas are less interesting because they're the ideas of any country. They're ideas that have to do with Russianness and ethnic character, which are the ideas of any country. And I think growing up in the Soviet Union for that reason was kind of different, because you were told that we were living to create a perfect state of people who were equal, and a country without rich people and without oppression. None of those things obviously turn out that way, but so I have really mixed feelings about the Soviet Union.
So that's a great answer. Thank you. Let me see. We have a couple more here, and we have a bit more time. So there's a question here which has gotten a bunch of upvotes, which is, have you had any negative reactions from your family members about your efforts and or the final product? Still reading the apology if you address this in the text.
Right.
Was there a reluctance or a resistance from those you wrote about in your project?
Well, actually, I see on the in the little row of icons along the bottom of my screen that my mother's watching this. So
Great.
This will be really interesting.
So maybe she asked that question.
Right, exactly.
No, she didn't. Somebody else. Okay.
Well, I think actually this is something I was really worried about, because, writing a family memoir when your parents are alive is, you're taking your life into your hands. But I think, it was a really gradual process. There's a lot of things in this book, particularly those pertaining to my parents, that are really, really personal. And so that was, a project of treading carefully and trying to make sure that the people to whom those events happened, who told me about them, namely my mother mostly, and my father to a smaller extent, were comfortable with those appearing in the book. That was often a conversation. I believe that if you're writing a family book to settle scores, you're not really writing characters. You're writing, a polemic. And I wanted to write my parents as characters who had their own motivations and their own desires and their own inner life. So I try to understand them as adults, not just as parents or as children, but, as autonomous beings. And I have to say, I was really surprised and really grateful to my mother, especially because she said, well, as long as it's true and as long as you describe it accurately, I'm okay with it. And that was a real gift to me. That was a real blessing, because without her, this book could not have happened. So thanks, Mom.
So there's a nice follow-on question, and this might be a little bit tricky, so we'll see if it works.
Okay.
The question is, could you read another passage from the book so we can get a flavor of your family's experiences?
Ooh.
Do you have any other passage that comes to mind that might kind of help to evoke that?
Yeah, let me see if I can find something really
that would be nice.
Really, I'm going to read a little passage about Maria Nikolaevna, who was my great grandmother. She was my father's grandmother, and she was a interesting woman who had a big effect on my childhood. She always claimed that her brother was stolen by gypsies when he was 4. So this is a little passage about her. This is in the 70s when she was already in her 70s, and I was a little kid. Maria Nikolaevna enjoyed perusing the daily newspapers for political cartoons. A typical one showed a corpulent banker in a top hat and a monocle with the words NATO or USA or imperialist aggressor written across his chest in bold letters, lording over emaciated, dark-skinned laborers. And if I happened to be in the kitchen, Maria Nikolaevna pulled me up into her lap, pointed to the drawing, and read the caption aloud with patriotic gusto. On weekends, she baked apple pirashki that she doled out with military austerity. "Take one, and it'll be the death of you," she muttered when I crept next to the plate. Her peripheral vision was preternatural, and she didn't bother looking up from the newspaper when delivering this warning. If I was feeling brave and lunged, she gave chase, the metal-shod soles of her black orthopedic shoes ringing on the parquet floor. Maria Nikolaevna was unsentimental and believed in the power of unadorned speech. And so she remained suitably unimpressed when she found out in the late fall of 1969 that my mother was pregnant. "If you push one out, don't think I'm going to watch the brat, because I've got plenty to do without you," she told my mother one afternoon by way of a greeting. She relented after a 2-day argument with Tamara, that's my grandmother, her daughter, and my mother became the 4th resident of the 2-room apartment. My father's mother and his grandmother shared a 2-room apartment in Moscow. For weeks, my mother's pregnancy was the main topic of conversation around the kitchen table. "You're too young to waste away at home with a baby," Tamara counseled. "You're going to miss the dancing. An abortion takes 20 minutes and doesn't even hurt." The following night, Tamara would change her mind and urge her to keep the baby. My father said the decision was hers and stayed out of it. My mother didn't dare tell her mother. It was bad enough that she was dating a Gentile. She was convinced that if Raisa discovered that she was no longer a virgin, her heart would simply stop.
That's perfect. Thank you.
Of course.
So I have one final question for you.
Okay.
And which is the classic politics and prose question, which I believe they ask of almost every author, which is, what are you reading right now?
Right now, I'm actually doing some rereading. I'm reading a book that I really love that I think is actually kind of a great book to read in this moment, which is people being holed up at home, kind of not seeing their friends, not seeing their family. And it's a book called The Lonely City by Olivia Laing, who's a wonderful British author. And it is a book that came out a few years ago, and it is about, I think, 5 or 6 artists, musicians, and writers who wrote about loneliness. And it is about her own loneliness, but it is about people like Andy Warhol, David Wojnarowicz, Edward Hopper, the great, amazing performer and singer Klaus Nomi. And it is a book that makes me really, really happy to read. And it kind of makes me feel that sitting at home and reading is actually kind of a state of, heightened receptivity and grace, which, doesn't usually feel like it. So I'm very happy to Olivia for writing that book. And you should all read it. It's amazing. The Lonely City.
Well, I will follow up on that. And I will also, I have to say, I spent this week in isolation reading your book, and I felt that way, exactly that way, a state of heightened receptivity and grace.
Thank you.
And I thank you for that. And I thank you for writing this and for sharing it with the world. I think it's
Thank you, Ivan.
It's a gift. So
thank you. And thank you for everybody for tuning in.
Politics and prose. I believe you have some folks, you have some messages. Is that right? There we are.
Hey, Alan.
Hello.
Hey, Alan.
Yeah, I want to thank you both so much for just an amazing conversation during our first week here at PNP Live. And I'd like to remind you all to please click that link below to purchase Young Heroes of the Soviet Union. Yes, yes, definitely. It's your support that keeps us going at a time like this. And so we do hope that you will continue to shop online and attend more digital events like this one. And we also are offering curbside pickup and free shipping within the US. We do have a whole slate of events coming up as well. Tomorrow we have an event at 3, which is Robert Bryce with The Question of Power. And at 6 p.m., Ann Case and Angus Deaton with Deaths of Despair and the Future of Capitalism. There's a couple more on Sunday as well. Carl Rollison at 3 p.m. and Celeste Headley at 5 p.m. So please, also, you can look at, if you see right above, you'll see the Politics and Prose logo, and to the right of that, it says follow. If you click on that, you'll see the whole list of what we have planned coming up in the future. Thank you so much. Thank you both so much for being here tonight. That was fantastic. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So, we hope to see you all here again soon at PNP Live, and stay well read.
Bye-bye. Thanks, guys.
Bye-bye. Thank you.